The meeting that no one expected. The afternoon sun was warm over the quiet courtyard of a small conference center in Geneva. People moved in and out of the hall, their faces filled with polite smiles and calculated words. It was one of those high-level global summits where leaders from across the world gathered to talk about technology, future plans, and the responsibilities that came with power. Somewhere in that steady movement of suits and security stood two men whose names were known far beyond these walls. Shantanu Narayen, the calm yet sharp-eyed leader of Adobe, and Sundar Pichai, the thoughtful and humble head of Google. Both were used to packed schedules and endless demands. Neither knew that their short meeting here would start something that would touch lives far away from the polished glass walls of boardrooms. It began in the least dramatic way possible. Sundar was just stepping out to find a quiet spot for a phone call when he spotted Shantanu leaning against the low stone wall at the edge of the courtyard. He wasn't surrounded by the usual group of assistants and security. He was alone, staring down at a paper cup of coffee in his hands, as if lost in thought. There was something in that stillness, not the kind that comes from peace, but the kind that hides weight. Sundar had seen it before in people who carry more than anyone realizes. He thought about walking past, not wanting to intrude, but something told him to stop. "Long day already?" Sundar asked with a small smile, his voice gentle. Shantanu looked up, slightly surprised, and the two men shook hands. "You could say that," he replied, managing a faint smile. "Some days are heavier than others." He hesitated for a moment, then added quietly, "Today is one of those." It was unusual for two CEOs to share anything personal in a setting like this, but there was an honesty in Shantanu's voice that made Sundar stay. The conversation that followed was slow at first, a few words here and there about work, travel, and the summit's endless speeches. But then, without warning, it shifted. Shantanu spoke of someone he had met earlier that morning, a young software engineer from a small country whose team had been struggling to keep their company alive after a devastating flood. The engineer had traveled for days to get here, hoping for advice, perhaps even help. "She told me her team works nights in a small rented office," Shantanu said, "and that they've lost almost everything, except their will to keep going." Sundar listened closely. He had heard similar stories before, but the way Shantanu spoke made it clear that this one had stayed with him. "What did you say to her?" Sundar asked. "I told her that ideas matter more than resources," Shantanu said quietly. "But as I said it, I wondered if it was enough. Sometimes words feel too small for the weight people carry." A breeze swept through the courtyard, carrying with it the faint sound of voices from inside. Sundar felt something shift inside him, a reminder of why he had once believed in technology not just as an industry, but as a way to make lives better. "Maybe words aren't enough," he said, "but sometimes they can start something." Shantanu looked at him, curious. Sundar continued, "What if we did more than talk?" The idea wasn't clear yet, but both men felt the pull of it. Neither of them knew exactly where it would lead or how quickly events would begin to move. What they didn't realize was that just beyond this quiet corner, someone else had overheard part of their conversation, and that this unseen listener would become the unexpected spark that turned a passing conversation into a story that people around the world would soon be talking about. The summit would end in 2 days, but the real story was only beginning. The spark begins to spread the next morning in Geneva. The conference center was buzzing. Bright lights, media crews, and hurried footsteps filled every corridor. Yet, beneath the noise, there was a small, quiet current moving in the background. A chain of events that had started in that courtyard between Shantanu Narayen and Sundar Pichai. Neither of them yet knew how far it would reach. Shantanu had woken up early, still thinking about the young engineer from the day before. Her tired eyes and steady voice had stayed with him through the night. He found himself picturing her team, working long hours in a small room with old equipment, surrounded by reminders of what they had lost in the flood. There was resilience in her story, but also fragility. Shantanu couldn't shake the thought that she might be just one among many whose hopes were hanging by a thread. Sundar, meanwhile, was walking down a quiet hallway toward the morning panel session when he noticed a man seated on a bench, typing quickly on a laptop. It was not unusual at these events, but something about this man caught his attention. His suit was clean but worn, and his shoes had the scuffs of long travel. As Sundar passed, he glanced at the screen and saw lines of code. Not slides or emails, but real programming work. Sundar slowed down and asked, "Are you working on something for the summit?" The man looked up, startled, then smiled faintly. "No, sir. I'm fixing a bug before my team back home wakes up." Time zones don't wait for conferences. His voice carried the same quiet determination Sundar had heard from the young woman Shantanu had spoken about. Sundar sat down beside him. They spoke for several minutes, and Sundar learned that the man, Arif, was part of a small startup in a rural area far from big tech hubs. Like the young engineer from the day before, his team had been hit hard by disasters. Not floods this time, but rolling blackouts and poor infrastructure. Yet they kept building, driven by belief more than stability. What Sundar didn't know was that Arif had been the one who overheard the conversation in the courtyard the day before. He had heard Shantanu's words about ideas being stronger than resources, and Sundar's reply that maybe they could do more than talk. Those words had stayed with him all night. "I didn't mean to listen," Arif admitted, "but when you said that, I started thinking about what it would mean if people like you actually did step in." Sundar was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "What if we tried?" Meanwhile, across the building, Shantanu was finishing a panel discussion on innovation when one of his aides approached. "The young engineer from yesterday is here again," the aide said softly. "She asked if you had a moment." Shantanu looked toward the far side of the room, where she stood holding a small folder. She seemed nervous, but her gaze was steady. When they spoke, she explained that she had brought a proposal, not for funding, but for collaboration. Her idea was simple. If small teams like hers could connect directly with skilled volunteers from bigger companies, they could survive and grow without relying entirely on unstable resources. "We don't need rescue," she said. "We just need a bridge." By mid-afternoon, Sundar and Shantanu had found themselves in the same small meeting room, each bringing with them a story from that morning. They shared what they had heard, and an idea began to take shape, a network that would connect overlooked innovators with those willing to give time, guidance, and tools. No contracts, no corporate branding, just people helping people. But as they began to outline the first steps, an urgent message arrived. The young engineers' team had just lost their office, a structural collapse after heavy rain had made the building unsafe. They had nowhere to work, and their equipment was still inside. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then Sundar said quietly, "Maybe this starts today, not someday." And with that, the spark began to burn brighter. The first step into the storm. The call about the young engineers' team losing their office had changed the air in the room. Moments before, Sundar and Shantanu had been discussing ideas in calm tones, thinking in terms of weeks and months. Now it felt like every hour mattered. Shantanu leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his voice steady but sharp. "If we wait, they will scatter. People can only hold on for so long before survival pulls them away from the work they love." Sundar nodded, already pulling out his phone. He scrolled through contacts, searching for someone in Europe who could help arrange emergency workspace. "We can find them a temporary setup before the day ends," he said. "But it can't just be charity. It has to give them dignity. Make them feel they are still building, not just surviving." An aide knocked and stepped into the room. "Sir, the media is requesting interviews about the summit," he said. Sundar and Shantanu exchanged a glance. They knew that stepping in for this team could be done quietly, away from cameras, but the thought struck them both at the same time. What if telling this story could reach more people in need? What if it could inspire others to step forward? Still, there was risk. Big names taking public action could be seen as a publicity move, and the authenticity of what they wanted to build could be questioned. Sundar weighed it in his mind, then spoke softly. We'll keep the focus on them, not us. No press releases, no staged photos. If the story spreads, it will be because people see themselves in it. By noon, they had reached the young engineer on a video call. Her name was Samira. Behind her, the walls of the damaged office were visible. Cracked plaster, water stains, and scattered papers on the floor. Yet her voice was calm. My team is safe, she said. That's what matters. But without our workspace, I don't know how long we can keep this going. Shantanu smiled gently. You're not losing it, he said. You're moving to a better place. Give us a few hours. True to his word, Shantanu began calling contacts in Europe, while Sundar reached out to a community workspace network he had quietly supported for years. By late afternoon, they had arranged for Samira's team to use a small but fully equipped space in the heart of the city. Computers, high-speed internet, and most importantly, an open-door policy for collaborative projects. Arif, the man who had overheard their conversation the day before, was standing in the corner of that new space when Samira and her team walked in. Their eyes widened at the sight of clean desks, working machines, and walls covered in whiteboards waiting for ideas. This is yours, Arif said simply. For as long as you need. That evening, Sundar and Shantanu visited quietly. No photographers, no microphones. Just two leaders stepping into a room where the hum of work had replaced the silence of loss. Samira's team was already unpacking salvaged equipment, their conversations filled with plans instead of worry. As they were leaving, Samira stopped them at the door. You didn't just save our work, she said, her voice catching slightly. You reminded us why it matters. Walking back into the cool night air, Sundar looked at Shantanu and said, This can't be the only team. If we're serious, we start building the bridge tomorrow. They didn't know it yet, but tomorrow would bring a challenge far bigger than a single team's crisis. And it would test whether their idea could survive when politics, corporate rivalries, and public opinion began to close in. The ripples turned into waves. The morning after Samira's team settled into their new workspace, word began to spread. Not through headlines, but through whispers and messages shared between developers, students, and small business owners who had been struggling in silence. Someone from Samira's team had posted a simple photo online. A group of people smiling in a bright office with a caption that read, We thought we lost everything. Then strangers gave us back our future. Within hours, that post had been shared hundreds of times, then thousands. People from other parts of the world began leaving comments, stories of their own setbacks, moments when they wished someone had stepped in. And among those comments were quiet questions. Who helped you? How can we reach them? Sundar was in a meeting when his phone buzzed with a message from an old friend in India. Are you involved in this? If you are, it's a beautiful thing, but be ready. People are going to come to you now. By midday, the small idea that had begun in the courtyard was no longer theirs alone. Shantanu sat in a hotel room scrolling through messages sent to his private email, requests from small teams in Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia. Many were desperate, some barely holding their operations together. It's happening faster than we planned, Shantanu said during a call with Sundar. If we try to handle it ourselves, we'll collapse under the weight. We need a structure, a way for others to join in without losing the spirit of what we started. Sundar agreed, but there was another problem. That morning, a large tech news outlet had published an article hinting that two major CEOs were working behind the scenes to influence startups in struggling regions. The tone was skeptical, suggesting there might be hidden motives, market expansion, political influence, or even image repair. By evening, the article had sparked debates online. Some praised the effort, while others questioned it. And the louder the conversation became, the more difficult it was to keep the focus on the people they wanted to help. Arif noticed the change immediately. The new workspace for Samira's team had started receiving calls from journalists asking for interviews. "They want to turn this into a headline," he told Sundar. "But the truth is, most people won't read past the headline. They'll never understand what's really happening here." Shantanu thought for a long moment before speaking. "Then we have to show them, not by telling our story, but by letting the teams tell theirs." That night, they reached out to Samira and several others they had quietly supported over the years. They asked them to record short, honest videos, not polished speeches, but real accounts of what they were working on and why it mattered. By the next day, those videos were online, unbranded and unedited. One showed Samira's team designing flood-resistant communication devices for remote villages. Another featured Arif's group creating an offline education platform for areas without stable internet. The voices were raw, the work was visible, and the message was clear. This was not about corporate gain, it was about human connection and resilience. The response was overwhelming. Offers of mentorship, equipment, and even shared workspace began pouring in from people in over 20 countries. But with that surge came new challenges. Managing so many connections, ensuring fairness, and protecting the teams from exploitation would require more than goodwill. And just as they began to put that system together, a private email reached Shantanu from someone he hadn't spoken to in years. A former colleague who now worked for a powerful organization with deep influence in global tech policy. The message was short but heavy. "We need to talk. What you're doing is making the wrong people nervous." The resistance in the shadows. The email sat in Shantanu's inbox like a weight. The words were polite, almost friendly, but they carried an undercurrent that he could not ignore. "The wrong people are nervous." It was the kind of sentence that could mean anything, or everything. He read it again, slower this time, and felt a dull knot form in his chest. He replied with a single line: "When and where?" The meeting was arranged for that evening, in a quiet cafe away from the summit crowds. Sundar insisted on joining. "If this is about what we're building," he said, "then we face it together." When they arrived, the man waiting at the corner table was already watching them. He stood, shook their hands, and gestured for them to sit. "You've created something people are calling the bridge," he began, "and that name is spreading faster than you think." Shantanu said nothing, letting him continue. "It's a good idea," the man admitted. "Too good, maybe. But here's the problem. The more you connect small, independent teams to resources without formal oversight, the more you threaten certain markets and political interests. You're bypassing structures that have been in place for decades. That doesn't make everyone happy." Sundar leaned forward. "So they see hope and innovation as a threat?" The man's eyes softened for a moment. "Some do. Because it shifts control. Right now, the people who hold the purse strings decide which ideas survive. You're trying to give that power back to the innovators themselves. Don't be surprised if you face pushback. Not in open daylight, but in ways that can make progress difficult." They left the cafe with more questions than answers. Outside, the cold air carried the sound of traffic, but Sundar's mind was elsewhere. "We have to decide," he said quietly. "Do we slow down and keep this under the radar, or do we push forward knowing there will be resistance?" Shantanu didn't hesitate. "We push forward. Because if we stop now, every team waiting for a bridge will stay stranded." The next week tested that resolve. Small signs of obstruction began appearing. Shipments of donated equipment delayed without reason. Communication lines to certain teams suddenly unreliable, and, in one case, a workspace partnership revoked at the last moment. It was subtle but consistent. Samira's team felt the pressure too. One evening, she called Shantanu to say that a potential investor had pulled out after hearing concerning things about their new connections. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the strain. "I don't know what's happening," she said, "but it feels like someone wants us to disappear." Instead of retreating, Sundar and Shantanu decided to strengthen the bridge by making it impossible for any single gatekeeper to control. They began setting up a distributed network, a chain of volunteers, mentors, and micro-donors across multiple countries, none of whom relied on a central authority. If one link failed, the others could still carry the weight. They worked late into the night, contacting people they trusted deeply, old friends, retired engineers, community leaders in remote towns. Each conversation was personal, built on trust rather than contracts. And slowly the network grew stronger, harder to dismantle. But even as they celebrated small victories, they both knew that the quiet resistance would not simply give up. And one night, their fears were confirmed when an urgent encrypted message arrived from Arif. Someone tried to break into the workspace. Nothing was taken. They just left a note. The note had only 3 words, written in neat block letters. "Stop the bridge." The choice that would define them. The note sat on the table between Sundar and Shantanu. Its 3 words small, but heavy. "Stop the bridge." Arif had taken a photo and sent it through a secure channel, his message short and urgent. "Whoever left it didn't take anything," he'd said on the call, "but they wanted us to know they could get in." The room was silent for a long moment. Outside, the city was alive with the hum of late-night traffic, but inside it felt as if the air had grown heavier. Sundar leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had been in high-pressure situations before, but this was different. This wasn't a competition for market share or a negotiation over contracts. This was about people's lives and futures. "We always knew this might happen," Shantanu finally said, his voice low but steady. "We are changing the way power moves, and people who benefit from the old way will fight back." Sundar nodded, but his thoughts were on Samira's team, on Arif, on the dozens of small groups that had begun to find hope through the bridge. If they stopped now, those people would be left standing on half-built paths. "We don't stop," Sundar said, "but we change how we work." The plan they formed that night was different from anything they had imagined in the courtyard weeks before. Instead of the bridge being something they owned or even led, they would make it a living network that belonged to everyone in it. No central headquarters, no single point of failure. If one team was attacked, the others would keep going. The next few weeks were a blur. Secure servers were set up in multiple countries. Mentorship groups began meeting online in rotating schedules, so no single time zone could be targeted. Equipment was moved through unconventional channels, sometimes even hand-carried by trusted travelers rather than shipped. And while they worked, the human stories kept growing. Samira's team completed their first batch of flood-resistant communication devices and shipped them to villages that had been cut off during storms. Arif's offline education platform reached its first milestone. Lessons downloaded in places where children had never touched a computer before. Small victories lit up the network like lanterns, each one a quiet defiance against the note's threat. But there was one final decision that would test them both. An international conference on technology for development was being held in Singapore, and several teams from the bridge were invited to present their work. It was the first time their network would be openly visible in such a high-profile space. The warning note still echoed in their minds, and security experts advised them to decline. Sundar looked at Shantanu across a hotel desk scattered with papers. "If we go, we send a message. Not just to the people we help, but to the ones trying to stop us." Shantanu gave a small smile. "Then we go." The day of the conference, the air in the hall was charged. As Samira spoke on stage, showing images of her team's work, There was no doubt in anyone's mind that this was bigger than two CEOs or a single project. The bridge was now a movement, unbranded, borderless, and impossible to shut down. Applause filled the room, and Sundar glanced at the crowd. Somewhere in the sea of faces, he thought he saw a man watching them with a hard, unreadable expression. But it didn't matter anymore, because the bridge no longer belonged to them. It belonged to everyone who chose to keep building, no matter the warnings. Outside, the night was warm, and as they walked away from the hall, Shantanu said softly, "We started this thinking we could help a few people. Turns out, they were the ones who showed us how to be brave." And in that moment, they knew the note's command had failed. The bridge would keep standing. The end. The bridge beyond them months had passed since the conference in Singapore, but its echo had not faded. The videos of Samira, Arif, and dozens of other bridge teams had traveled across continents, not because of marketing campaigns, but because people shared them from one hand to another, one screen to another. The bridge had become something no one could own, yet everyone could claim. Sundar and Shantanu found themselves in a strange position. They were no longer the center of the network. In fact, they were now only two voices among thousands. And that was exactly how they wanted it. The bridge was running on its own, a self-healing system where mentors, innovators, and communities worked together without waiting for permission from leaders or institutions. But one night, an unexpected message reached both of them. It was from the young engineer they had met at the very start, the one whose story had first lit the spark in Shantanu's mind. She had been quiet for months, busy working on her own. The message was simple. Come if you can. There's something I want you to see. 2 weeks later, they arrived in her small town, far from the polished cities and conference halls. She led them to a modest community center, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and handwritten signs on the walls. Inside, the air buzzed with quiet energy. Dozens of people sat in small groups, some with laptops, others with notebooks or simple tools in their hands. On one side, a teenager was teaching basic coding to a group of children. In another corner, two women were repairing old laptops to give to students. And in the center of it all, the young engineer stood, her smile wide. "This is our own bridge," she said. "We didn't wait for someone to send help. We built it with what we had, and with the guidance we got from others in the network. Every person here is working on something that makes life better for someone else." Sundar looked around slowly, realizing what he was seeing. The bridge was no longer a metaphor. Here, it was a living, breathing space, built from the ground up by people who refused to give up. Outside, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, Shantanu turned to her and asked, "Do you need anything? Funding? Equipment?" She shook her head. "We'll always welcome resources, but what we need most is for you to keep telling people they can do this too. Because once they believe they can, they will." Later, as they walked through the quiet streets, Sundar said softly, "We thought we were building a bridge for others, but maybe we were just helping them see that they could build it themselves." Shantanu nodded. "And that's why it will never fall." Months later, in a village halfway across the world, a group of strangers began working together in a small room with no air conditioning and one working fan. They didn't know Sundar or Shantanu personally. They had never met Samira or Arif, but they had heard about the bridge, and with nothing more than belief and a little help from someone far away, they began to build their own. In the end, the bridge was never about who started it. It was about the countless hands that kept adding to it, one plank, one step, one act of kindness at a time. And that was why it would outlive them all.